Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be discussing the Olive Branch Petition with Dr. Denver Brunsman. So before we begin, I want to remind you that this program is being recorded. Your camera and your mic are automatically turned off and the chat has been disabled. That's because we do record the program and it is available on our website for you to show in classrooms throughout the year. If you wish to submit a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Summer and Taylor, our two interns, are on the back end managing those questions, and Taylor will be joining us at the end of the program to ask a few. And that brings us to tonight's featured document. It plays an important part in the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. It's the July 8th, 1775 petition to King George III attempting to make peace with England. And if you haven't heard of that before, that's okay. A lot of people haven't. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Denver Brunsman, who's going to explain it all to us tonight. He is the associate professor and chair of the history department at George Washington University. And he's published numerous books and has worked on a lot of programs with us that provide professional development to teachers. And I should say he's worked with professional development with other organizations too. But in fact, just 15 minutes ago, Denver, you were at one of our teacher seminars talking to teachers about the American Revolution. So we're really grateful for your tireless work with educators and for joining us tonight. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy. Appreciate you and your team. It's been a real pleasure to work with Katie Heiserman and Taylor Williams. And it's great to have Summer with us tonight. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in here on July 3rd, on July 4th Eve, not least my students from George Washington University that are joining tonight. And also, you mentioned the educators that have been part of my summer seminar on George Washington and his world. These are the real brave souls that are going to spend another hour with me tonight after four nights. And I just got to say that this was such an exciting invitation to get to think about, to talk about the Olive Branch petition. This is not something that I think everybody knows about. So, in some ways I thought, wow, this is the nerdiest thing ever. I get to talk about the Olive Branch Petition for an entire hour on its 250th anniversary. I mean, I can't think of anything better. And we're coming upon, of course, the 250th anniversary of American independence and the American Revolution. And I think my one hope for this anniversary is that the American public in some way is able to grasp the real complexity of this event and how difficult it was to declare independence. And I think this would be a more useful lesson for us in our own, more difficult and complicated times than just assuming it was all very easy. So I think the Olive Branch Petition is very helpful in highlighting that complexity. Sometimes I think it's like one of those primary sources that, just needs a hug, kind of like the Articles of Confederation. They didn't quite work out, but they're still important, and we need to know about it. So we can get into it. We can go to the slides on the.
Yeah. I have to say though, I am now going to use that phrase, a primary source that needs a hug. 100% going to use that phrase.
They're out there. I mean, the blueprint for New Coke in the 1980s. I mean, we could make a whole list of things that just need a little hug. So why don't we start by just thinking about how the Olive Branch Petition came about and what it was. Sandy mentioned this, that I think in the very simplest terms, this was the last gasp effort by the Americans through the Second Continental Congress to forge some type of reconciliation, some type of peace with Great Britain. It was written by John Dickinson. Incidentally, who's the lead author of the Articles of Confederation as well. So he's the author of the documents that need a hug. And in interpreting the American Revolution, I have a couple of terms up here. I think there's a couple of different approaches. I think one is more traditional. I think one is something that we do more in the academy these days. And so I'll start with this second term, Anglicization. It's kind of hard to say and hard to spell, but it's really, really influential in the way that scholars think about the coming of the American Revolution. And I think the simplest definition is that over the course of the 18th century, the American colonies didn't become just more and more American until they finally just had to bust loose and declare independence. Something actually different happened. The American colonies became more and more integrated into the British Empire, and they actually became more and more culturally British. They became more culturally British in their political culture, in their religious culture, in their consumption patterns. They loved all the different products, all the different baubles that were made that came out of Great Britain, everything from ceramics to fashion. And so it seems counterintuitive that they were becoming more British before they declared independence. But I think if we can kind of think of that as a premise, it will help to make the Olive Branch Petition make more sense, and really this whole period make more sense. Now, Americanization, of course, matters because we know that they declared independence. They created a new country, the United States, and there was important differences between the American colonies and Great Britain. There's no doubt about that. But if we go back at that time, people I think are surprised to learn that the colonists never actually called themselves American until the Imperial crisis with Britain. It's not till the 1760s and 1770s that you see that. You know, they called themselves Marylanders and New Yorkers and Virginians, or they thought themselves as British subjects. The people that called the American colonists American were actually the British in London. So in that sense, the revolution becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, you know, for all the educators out there, a fun way to think about this and the way you might teach it is Paul Revere's, famous ride in the spring of 1775 to warn the Massachusetts countryside that the British are coming, the British are coming. Except we know now that Paul Revere almost certainly wouldn't have said that, because even at that late date, the American colonists still thought of themselves as British. So they would say, Paul, relax, we're here. He would have said the regulars are coming, or the redcoats are coming, or the way that Paul Revere House in Boston interprets it is the redcoats are turning out, if you want to be very, very specific. So there were American things that, there was a tradition of local representation, direct representation, local control, an appreciation for individual and corporate rights. There was a rejection of aristocracy and hereditary titles. America was already known as a younger son society because, of course, all the older sons, especially the oldest sons in Europe, inherited everything, so they would never come to America. And Benjamin Franklin boasted in his autobiography that he was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations. But he wrote that after the American Revolution took place. And so this process of defining what it meant to be America was really ongoing, and in many ways kind of began with the revolution. It didn't end with it. And it's something I think we're still doing to this day, because we still live in the society and under the frame of government that was created by this revolution. So think about the tension between these two approaches to the revolution as we move through this amazing document tonight. And I'll just say something real briefly about the image that we have here, because I think it helps to capture both Anglicization and Americanization. This is an engraving that's based off of the 1770 painting by Benjamin West, The Death of General Wolfe. And James Wolfe was a British general who fought in the 7 Years' War against France. He died on the Plains of Abraham, just outside of Quebec City, in September of 1759. And this painting is often called the birth of Romanticism in art, that we have the hero dying for his nation. And there's British imagery all over the place, including with the Union Jack, the British flag. But we also see a little bit of the Americanization, particularly in the Native American in the foreground. Native Americans came to represent America more broadly in art in the second half of the 18th century. So we see the melding of these two concepts. Even in the artists, Benjamin West was American by birth. He was born in the American colonies, but then he spent his career primarily in London. So there's really kind of two different worlds, two different cultural and intellectual traditions that are creating this period. So we can advance to the next slide. So we want to situate the Olive Branch Petition within the larger imperial crisis between America and Great Britain. And to do that, I think the most useful way to think about what took place in the 1760s and 1770s is to think about it as three crises within this one larger crisis. And this is how people at the time actually experienced these events that, legislation like the Stamp Act came out, there's protests, there's debate, and then there's some kind of outcome. Same with the Townsend Act's crisis. And so we think about it this way, it's a little bit closer to how people actually experienced it. And we avoid what I consider the worst sin in history and the worst swear word in history. And it's so bad. It's a word that doesn't just have 4 letters, it has 10 letters, 10 terrible letters. And the word is inevitable. We never want to accept that events in history were just bound to happen, that they were inevitable, because that really takes away the whole reason that we're historians and we think about the past and asking questions about how and why different events took place. And I have an anecdote for that swear word, and that's an 11-letter word, contingency. Contingency refers to events that take place, to human action, to really the stuff of history. And so we want to think about how different events affected the past, changed those possible outcomes. And so if we look at the three crises, the first two, the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts, were really fights over taxation. And so for educators who are watching, you might use the magical phrase, no taxation without representation. It's so great that we've adopted it for our license plates here in DC, which say that say taxation without representation. Um, and it rhymes, that works, and it's accurate. But what I want to encourage you to do is not to stop there, because when we get to the last crisis, the one that involved the Olive Branch Petition, it's a phrase that doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily, and it's no legislation without consent. Right? That's not going to be on anybody's license plate. It's not going to make a bumper sticker, but it speaks to this sort of higher principle behind the revolution, and that was sovereignty or control. And that's ultimately what the American colonists wanted from Great Britain. That's what they were, that's what they were fighting for. And that really comes to light in this last crisis, in which, if anything, they're actually getting a reduction in their taxes. So who wages a revolution over a tax cut? Well, it turns out the American colonists, because they felt like the British were violating their sovereignty with the Tea Act and other acts. So in this last crisis, before the Olive Branch Petition took place, I'm just going to list some other things that happened. The Tea Act happened, which I could go into the details in the Q&A, but actually reduced the price of tea for the American colonists. They didn't like that, so you get the Boston Tea Party. In response from the British, you get the coercive or intolerable acts. Then the Americans respond with their first Continental Congress. After that, the war begins. You have the Second Continental Congress. And finally, we get to, and starts in May of 1775. And then we finally get to July. And this effort to, again, make peace with the Olive Branch Petition, something that's passed on July 5th, 1775, and is finalized on July 8th. So the big point, if you look at all these years, is that it was hard to declare independence. It took a long time. There's a lot of events. And I think this all reflects that Anglicization, that these were very British people, and they were willing to give the British the benefit of the doubt for a pretty long time. But eventually, they gave up their patience. So we can advance to the next slide. I want to highlight something in particular in the context of this primary source in this period, and that's the war. Just as we think it's probably natural that the colonists were becoming more and more American over time before they declared independence, I think it's natural to think that they declared independence and then fought the war. That just seems like a more logical order of events. But sometimes history isn't logical, and contingency works in different ways. And the war starts more than a year before independence. So the war was taking place, and it's really the reason behind this peace offering from the Americans. And so we have here the war starting at Lexington, Massachusetts in April of 1775, where Paul Revere rode and warned the people that the British are coming, the British are coming. Except he didn't say that, right? I'm just testing all of you. Right? The redcoats are coming, the regulars are turning out. And the war it's not just kind of a correlation that it comes before independence, but I think it actually had a causal influence. And I'm often asked, what caused the American Revolution? What was it the Stamp Act, or was it the Proclamation Act, a proclamation of 1763, or the Townsend duties, and the answer is, I don't think it was one single thing. And it's different in that respect of, say, the Civil War, where historians have agreed for, a couple generations that one thing really causes the Civil War, and it was slavery. You can't point to just one thing with the American Revolution. It's all of these different things that, again, reflect this larger principle of sovereignty. But with that disclaimer aside, if I had to pick one thing, it would be the war. That the war is the most crucial thing in acting as an expedient to independence. And I'll just give you an example of this and how this worked for different founders. Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of his adult life in London, working as an agent for the colony of Pennsylvania. Today we'd call him a lobbyist. But he came home in the summer of 1775 to the war. And he wrote to his best friend in London because he was so appalled at what had taken place. So this is BF writing to his BFF, a man named William Strahan, who was also a printer and a politician. He was in Parliament. And I'll just have to give a little bit of a warning. If there's any middle school educators, you might want to be careful using this one. This is kind of a heartbreaking letter here, heartbreaking breakup letter. Franklin writes, "You are a member of Parliament, and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours. B. Franklin." So that really hurts, right? It's really sad. Well, fortunately, Franklin did not send this letter. He kept it in the draft box, and historians speculate why that is exactly. Maybe he just wanted to preserve this strong friendship that he had with Strahan. There's also a theory that because he had spent so much time in London, he needed some kind of evidence that he wasn't a loyalist, that he could say, "No, look, I wrote this letter to my BFF, and I'm totally on the American side." So we're not entirely sure. But the sentiments he expressed were sincere, and they show up in the writings of other leading revolutionaries. And so nobody was calling for independence before really the later summer and the fall of 1775. I mean, just privately. Even then, they're not calling for it publicly until after Common Sense was published in January of 1776. And again, it's the war that kind of pushed them to that point. So we can advance to the next slide. So the war has started, once the Second Continental Congress begins to meet. And so it's a war body. One of their first decisions is to make George Washington the commander of American forces, to send him to Massachusetts, where the siege of Boston was taking place. And you can think of the importance, I think, that the Americans felt just by where they're meeting. They had met in a smaller, very nice building, but a smaller building before Carpenter's Hall, a few blocks from the Pennsylvania Assembly House. And they're moving into the larger digs. It reflects the importance of their cause. And we got to be careful again not to do the inevitable thing and call this place Independence Hall before it was Independence Hall. It actually gets named, the best theory is that gets named in the early 1820s when the Marquis de Lafayette returns to America, and he refers to the building by that name. So we can advance to the next slide. So one of the things that Congress has to do is actually wrestle with the British Olive Branch Petition. So maybe that will be another Inside the Vault in the future sometime. The British Olive Branch Petition is provided by the Prime Minister at the time, Lord North, and it's called the Conciliatory Proposal or the Conciliatory Proposition. And in essence, what it says is, you Americans, you're so wild about taxing yourselves. Fine, we'll let you tax yourselves. As long as you meet the targets that you need to for your own defense and to pay for your governments, that's fine. You go ahead, you can tax yourselves. And the Americans reject this immediately. And I find this really interesting because through the Imperial crisis, you can just see the moving goalposts and the evolution of of different views and this Americanization process really taking place. This might have been accepted. In fact, I think it would have been accepted as a solution to the Stamp Act crisis, and maybe even as a solution to the Townsend Act crisis. But by 1775, the Americans reject it because they see it as a violation of their sovereignty. Even if they did tax themselves, the British are really kind of orchestrating it behind the scenes. So they knew that this existed, they rejected it, and that leads to some talk about, well, maybe we should have our own conciliatory proposal. We can advance. And so that gives us the star of the show, John Dickinson, who was a really, really fascinating character, and, historical actor in the Second Continental Congress. He's from Pennsylvania, also Delaware, which are kind of one and the same in this period. And he actually wrote the second most read and printed pamphlet of the American Revolutionary era. And that was called The Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. And he wasn't a farmer, he was a lawyer, but that shows he was a good politician right from the start. Nobody wants to read letters from a Pennsylvania lawyer. But the Pennsylvania Farmer was wildly popular. It came out as a series and then was printed as a whole. And again, it's kind of part of this tax fight that the Americans aren't going to accept any taxation for which they don't have representation or give their consent. But Dickinson is a moderate. He wasn't for independence even once the war started. And for that reason, he's the villain in the glorious musical 1776. He's the one who is really arguing against independence. And in real life, off of Broadway, he really didn't sign the Declaration. But then he does something really interesting. He fights for the American cause, and he sticks with it. And as I mentioned, he goes on to be the lead author of the Articles of Confederation. And incidentally, he had written the sort of proposal to King George in 1774, asking for some kind of reconciliation, which George ignored. So Dickinson is kind of 0 for 2, at least with King George. That somebody might have just told John, George is just not that into you. He just doesn't want to. He doesn't want to accept the things that you're writing. But he writes the articles, and he's a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention from Delaware. So he's part of the Constitution. Incidentally, he doesn't sign that either, although someone signs for him. He had to leave, I think, because he was ill. So he doesn't end up signing these really famous documents. But really an amazing leader, and I think someone worth talking about and teaching about, again, to show the complexity of views, that someone could feel so many different things, that wouldn't want to support independence, but then once that happened, would fight for his home side, his home country. And we can advance. I think we're going to get to the source here. So now we're officially inside the vault here, and this is the publication that we're going to look at that printed the Olive Branch Petition. And this was something that wasn't made into a broadside. It wasn't made into like a publication on its own. I think that most people would have read it in whole this way, in sort of this larger journal of the proceedings of Congress. And I love this so much. It's got a heart on the on the cover, which shows that everything Congress did was with love. They were true romantics. And this particular edition that we're going to talk about, if you look closely at the bottom, was actually reprinted in London, which is interesting. So the British are also going to be learning about what had taken place roughly about a year before, several months before, once this thing is actually printed. So a couple other things that are happening at this time. So I mentioned the war is happening, and so it seems kind of odd that they're fighting the war, but they're also asking for peace. And if you think about events today in the world, that happens to this day. That that's why we have ceasefires and different conflicts, and so this is kind of like that. And it's really fascinating that even the day after they agreed to the Olive Branch Petition, they agreed to it on July 5th. On July 6th, they adopted something called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And so they're doing peace and then they're doing war the very next day. And Dickinson was involved in that document as well. Again, it's very complicated. So we can get into the heart of this document now. So here's the magic pages where they have the Olive Branch Petition. And as I mentioned, it's adopted by Congress on July 5th. It's signed on July 8th. And not everybody agrees. Again, this was the moderates in Congress that are really pushing this. Radicals, more radical people like John Adams didn't agree with this. But they didn't show that. They didn't show that, some people disagreed. Congress really acted together through consensus at this time. So this is being delivered to England as a product of Congress, not of John Dickinson, not of this, moderate faction within Congress. And it's sent specifically to some of the American agents that were in London. So one was a man named Richard Penn of the famous Penn family. So he's of Pennsylvania, and Arthur Lee of the famous Lee family in Virginia. He's the brother of Francis Lightfoot Lee and of Richard Henry Lee, who's the author, the supporter of the Resolution for Independence that's eventually approved on July 2nd, before the Declaration is approved on July 4th. And I've mentioned 1776. Richard Henry Lee most definitely has the best song, I think, in that in that musical. So we can go now to some of the actual content of the Olive Branch Petition. So what did it actually say? I think it's really fascinating that this is considered kind of the moderate position at this time. It would have been very radical, 5 years earlier, 7, 8 years earlier. And again, I think it shows how events had progressed. So they're gonna start out addressing the king, and they're gonna say, "We shall decline the ungrateful talk of the describing the irksome variety of artifices practiced by many of your majesty's ministers, the delusive pretenses, fruitless terrors, and unavailing feverties that have from time to time been dealt out by them in their attempts to execute this impolitic plan, or of tracing through a series of years past the progress of the unhappy differences between Great Britain and these colonies that have flowed from this fatal source." So I feel like there needs to be like snap, after that. That's pretty hard hitting. And especially after they say at the beginning, we're not going to bring up all the bad things that have happened over the last several years, but then they kind of list them, right? They're trying to emphasize that this, things haven't been going great, but they blame the king's ministers, really crucial, because they're going to put their faith in George III to solve this problem. And because of that, they're going to blame them. And then, they cite things like the unavailing feverities. I mean, nothing's worse than that. This is pretty bad, and they all flow from this fatal source. So this is a very, serious thing that they're talking about. And we can move on to the next part of the petition, in which they're really going to explain their purpose, like what they're up to. Why are they even writing? And they say, "Knowing to what violent resentments and incurable animosities civil discords are apt to exasperate and inflame the contending parties, we think ourselves required by indispensable obligations to Almighty God, to your Majesty, to our fellow subjects, and to ourselves, immediately to use all the means in our power, not incompatible with our safety, for stopping the further effusion of blood and for averting the impending calamities that threaten the British Empire." So the stakes couldn't be any higher, right? And that's what they're really communicating here, that this is a real war, and it was expanding. One of the decisions that Congress made before the Olive Branch Petition was actually to invade Canada. And you want to speak through the Hazal ways of history and say, no, don't do it. Don't do it. It's, it's kind of like invading Russia in European history. It never goes well, and it didn't go well for the Americans. But the war is expanding. It's a bloody war, and And they kind of position themselves here. They're almost taking the high road. They're saying, King George, your ministers might be going low, but we're going to go high. Your ministers might be doing all these horrible things, but we're here to make peace, and you can work with us to solve this problem. So let's see how this turns out. We can go to the next, and this is really the last part of the pamphlet. And we might think of this as the ask. What are they actually asking George? And it's a little bit confusing what they're actually asking for. They're not super specific. So let's look at this. They write, "We therefore beseech your majesty that your royal authority and influence be graciously interposed to procure us relief from our afflicting fears and jealousies occasioned by the system before mentioned, and to settle peace through every part of your dominions, with all humility submitting part of your dominions, with all humility submitting to your majesty's wise consideration, that your majesty may enjoy a long and prosperous reign, and that your descendants may govern your dominions with honor to themselves and happiness to their subjects, is our sincere prayer." So they don't have a specific plan. They're really just asking George to intervene somehow, to do something to stop, the war, to create a pause of some sort. And the full gist of the proclamation or the petition comes through here that your ministers have acted terribly. It's led to this unfortunate situation, and really only you can solve it. And it never hurts to have a little bit of flattery at the end, which they they do. They're they're praying for the king, and they certainly recognize him. I'll just mention one quick thing, which is kind of just a fun part of primary sources and history, and that's if you look at the third line where it says "Majesties," it looks like wife consideration, and that's that long S, that F there. That's a correct transcription, but that's that F that was used in early English printing to really indicate a longer S, and I get that question a lot from teachers in dealing with primary sources, and the German language still has that to this day. The S that I think it's called the double S. All right, so they've done the ask, and now the big question is, they're going to send it off. They're going to get it to Penn. They're going to get it to Lee. They're going to get it to the crown. And what is the king going to do? And so we'll turn to our next source. So we have a letter in the Gilder Lehrman collection from Francis Lightfoot Lee, again, the brother of Arthur Lee. And it's a fun letter to just kind of see how people gossiped at the time and talked about different things. And it's in January of 1776, and he's referencing the Olive Branch Petition and what the king had done. So I'll give the big spoiler alert. George refuses to accept the petition. A week or so before, acting on the news from the Battle of Bunker Hill and the ongoing fighting that was taking place in Massachusetts, George declared the American colonies in rebellion, to be an open rebellion. And so, it's pretty much akin to a full declaration of war. And so, I guess the counterfactual, the question might be, is if the Olive Branch Petition would have gotten there maybe a little faster, because it shows up about a week after that, may have changed events. I mean, possibly, we're not sure. But based on George's behavior before, when the first Continental Congress petitioned him, and again, when Dickinson wrote to him before in the fall of 1774, George also didn't accept that petition. And at that point, he said, blows must decide. So, George was not quite the boogeyman of the Declaration of Independence, but he was definitely a hardliner. And for that reason, I'll cite another musical, Hamilton, where I think it gets George about right, that he really did want to do everything possible to keep his subjects within the empire. So in this letter, as part of this gossip, Lee is writing, and it has news. He's actually writing from Philadelphia at the time, but he has news from what happened in London. And he says that Richard Penn was actually deposed by the House of Lords about the Olive Branch Petition and other things. And so this is the exact quote from the letter. It says, referring to Richard Penn, it says, "Who carried the East Petition," that means the Olive Branch Petition, "to the king, being examined before the House of Lords. His answers were short and clever and seemed to have weight with some of that body, who had before been kept in the dark. The expression is, he had made several Quakers of them." And I love that. Penn's a Quaker, of course, someone who supported peace, and that he was persuasive, he was influential, and that members of Parliament at the time didn't know about the Olive Branch Petition. So this is something of, political news to them, that what, the Americans are trying to make peace with us. And this is significant because the American Revolutionary War turned out to be really Britain's most unpopular war of the long 18th century, stretching back to 1688 and going forward through the Napoleonic Wars of 1815, and maybe one of the most unpopular wars in British history, actually, if you just measure public opinion in different ways. So again, it shows a spectrum of views, and that the British weren't all the bad guys. That is complicated. And in fact, this guy Richard Penn, who's delivering the Olive Branch Petition, he ended up staying loyal to the crown. he actually stays British. So there's a lot of people choosing different sides, different identities in this era. So I think now we can turn to the aftermath. Once the Americans find out that George did not accept their petition, and even worse, that he's declared them an open rebellion and he's going to make full war on them, the whole project of the Olive Branch Petition backfires on Dickinson and the other moderates, because what it ends up really doing is emboldening the radicals, the John Adams types in Congress, who could look at it and say, "I told you so. I told you that they were not going to receive this, that they weren't going to make peace with us." And so Congress acts. They actually agree to this resolution here, and this was made into a broadside and circulated immediately. And I'll just read the very first part, which refers to the Olive Branch Petition. If you squint, you might even be able to see the first word, "whereas." It says, "Whereas the petitions of these United Colonies to the king for the redress of great and manifest grievances have not only been rejected, but treated with scorn and contempt." And again, that's the news they're going to be getting from their people in London, that, the king, it's not like he thought really hard about this, but that he just completely dismissed it. And as part of making war on the colonies, something that Britain had done as basically said that they could capture any American ship at sea, that they could capture the ship, make it into a prize, and in some cases impress the sailors or force them into service. And so what Congress says here is that we can do that as well. And it calls for the arming of American ships at sea to essentially make war on British vessels, both naval vessels, but also just merchant ships. So again, the war, this effort at peace, in some ways had actually opened the war even further. And so I would never say that at this point, independence was completely inevitable. Got to be careful with that word. But it certainly was much more of a possibility and really even probable heading into the later spring and the summer of 1776. And I hope through this discussion that you have a greater appreciation for the role that the Olive Branch Petition played in all of this. And I think with that, we can take some questions and talk about this.
Yeah, Dr. Brunsman, we've got a good amount of questions. So let's
Right.
just jump right in. Yeah. All right. So, Maria F. asked, what founding fathers were in favor of revolution and which ones wanted to work things out with the king? And then more specifically, what was Thomas Jefferson's position?
Okay, very great question. And I think that they all evolve in different ways over this sort of long period of about 13 years of the American resistance, from the end of the Seven Years' War to the Declaration of Independence. I'll just give you an example. I talked about Franklin. When the Stamp Act is passed, Franklin is so anglicized. I mean, he goes from being the most British of the founders to the most American. But at this point, he was the most British. He's actually lobbying to get his friends jobs as the Stamp Act distributors in different colonies. He doesn't even think that this law might be a problem. He just kind of assumes that it will be followed. And so they all kind of radicalize on different schedules. And some people that end up becoming arch loyalists, give you an example, Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, and then the governor of Massachusetts. He's hated by all the American patriots. He thought the Stamp Act was a terrible idea. He didn't agree with it. And a lot of loyalists, people that become loyalists, also didn't agree with it. In terms of the different revolutionaries, I would just say that the people that we often associate with being at the forefront of independence, and maybe the person that most associated is Samuel Adams, didn't support independence really until the later summer and fall of 1775. That even someone like that, he might have brought up the idea, he might have tested the idea in different ways, but in terms of actually supporting independence, they're all on a very late schedule. And I think this suggests, again, that this is not an event that was planned. It wasn't planned 30 years before, and people said, when we're ready, we're going to break away from Great Britain. This was a very contingent event. It was contingent on the 7 Years' War and the policies that Britain passed after the 7 Years' War, those three crises that I talked about. And that's what really, radicalized and ultimately Americanized the different founders. Did I get the second part of that question? I'm thinking that I might have missed part of it.
Yeah, so the second part was about Thomas Jefferson's position.
Yeah, real quick. So Jefferson's the same. He's on the same schedule, but he was pretty advanced ideologically. I mentioned that phrase, no legislation without consent. That comes from Jefferson, pamphlet that he writes in 1774, as much as anyone. He is the lead author of the necessity of taking up arms, this thing that Congress passes the day after they pass the Olive Branch Petition. And then he has to kind of work with Dickinson. Dickinson wants to change the language a little bit. Although Dickinson, he agrees that, they were in a war, that they had to defend themselves. So I hope that helps.
Okay, so our next question is from Susan I. How much optimism was there about the potential success of the Olive Branch Petition?
Yeah, what a great question. I wonder if you were John Dickinson at this point, if you're feeling kind of defeatist. You you had written this petition to the king the year before that was ignored, and I do think that there was some healthy skepticism that this was going to work. They had just the year before, the First Continental Congress decided that they were no longer going to recognize Parliament's authority over them, that they were only going to deal with the king. And it's maybe hard for us to kind of internalize with the Declaration of Independence and things like the musical Hamilton. But at one time, King George was beloved. He was loved. He was like heart on the pamphlet here, loved by the American colonists. And there's a good literature about how royalist the Americans were, that the Americans actually loved the British monarchy more than native born, British subjects in the British Isles. And so I think there was some hope, but I think there was also a sense, again, with the war happening, that time was running out.
So our next question is from Joseph L., who asked if King George would have just given the colonists a representative seat in the Parliament, do you think that that would have been enough to stave off war?
Oh, I love this question so much because we're trying to solve problems. We're trying to make peace, even today. And yeah, so I think if you look back over the Imperial crisis, there's a crucial moment. Again, I don't want to say it was inevitable. It wouldn't work out after this, but there's a crucial moment in the resolution of the Stamp Act crisis. And within the Stamp Act crisis, there is the idea that's shared, that's floated, that, maybe if we just had representatives in Parliament, that would be enough. That would do the job. And there's kind of a debate with Britain about what representation meant. Americans had this tradition of direct representation, meaning, like today, there was clear legislative districts and their different assemblies. Parliament worked differently. They had something called virtual representation. Sounds very modern, but it basically meant that one member of Parliament really represented everybody in the empire. That they did have some legislative districts, but some members of Parliament didn't come from a legislative district. So it was a lot different principle. And so the British told the Americans, they said, you are represented. We all represent you. And that was kind of a disagreement they had. To me, that seems like that's about kind of logistics, that they could maybe figure that out. The Americans ultimately decided that they weren't interested in just having a few representatives in Parliament, because they thought they would get outvoted, and that they thought they'd have to pay for these people to stay in Britain. They didn't want to do that. But to me, it kind of seems like that maybe could have been worked out. What happens at the end of the Stamp Act crisis, as Parliament changes their argument, and they don't say any longer, oh, we represent you. They actually say, we're sovereign over you. They declare parliamentary sovereignty. And at that point, it's a different fight, because the colonists all think their individual assemblies were sovereign. They haven't reached the point of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people are sovereign, which would come with the Constitution. But that's a much harder thing to resolve, and that's what the fight sort of becomes about after the Stamp Act crisis. So I love the idea, and I think that is the most obvious solution to the imperial crisis. That Britain did this with other kingdoms. They managed to do this with Scotland, merging the parliaments. They were able to do this. Ireland's kind of a different case, but they were able to do that to a certain extent with Ireland, with Wales. I mean, so it seems like there could have been a way to have the Americans in Parliament.
So our next question is from Niels N., who asked, to what degree was there a tradition of petitions by colonial governments to King George, or of governments or other groups within the British Isles? In other words, why did the Continental Congress think they could issue the Olive Branch Petition and expect any good result?
Good question. So there's a long tradition of colonies petitioning, the home government for one thing or another, and this was kind of one of the things that they did. So it wasn't that innovative necessarily, but I think it's a good point at the end of the question. Why did they think it might have succeeded? Because there was no evidence that this actually worked during the imperial crisis. What actually did work were the riots, were the protests. The colonists shut down the Stamp Act. Nobody paid the Stamp Act, except a few people in Georgia, because Georgia was so remote and not in touch with the other colonies that they didn't know that they weren't supposed to pay it. And so, this sort of more peaceful way of resolving things is not necessarily what worked at the time. But no, great thought.
So our next question is from Tamara G, who says there is a lot of division in our country today, and it seems that elected representatives do not represent all constituents. So, was the main push of independence led by a select few who may have been good at convincing people that revolution was the way to go, or was it truly a revolution for everyone?
Oh my goodness. Wow, what a rich question. And that's the debate. I mean, that's what historians continue to try to figure out. Part of it seems to be the perspective that you look at. A lot of leading loyalists thought that there were certain ringleaders of the resistance movement, the Sam Adams types, the John Hancocks, later the John Adamses, that were really leading people astray. But I will say that the percentages, at one point, John Adams famously divides everybody into thirds. That there was a third patriots, there was a third loyalist, and a third of the people were neutral. And those are not exactly correct, but they're not far off. And what's interesting about that, just sort of cocktail napkin estimate that John Adams made, is that today the historians look at it, and if you combine the people who were really true loyalists, which was somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population, and then you take the people who were true patriots, which maybe is a little bit higher, 30, maybe to a high of like 40%, that still leaves a huge number of people who are on the fence. And they're called the disaffected, the neutrals. And there was as many as 40% of the American people that didn't choose a side. So they were up for grabs. And this is why the war mattered. And I know sometimes we skip over wars and we talk more about the causes and the consequences, and I think that's great. But I think in this case, pointing out a few of the important events in the Revolutionary War is really critical, because this is where hearts and minds were secured or lost. Was when, with battles being won or lost, or areas being taken or given up. And so, I don't think it was inevitable that the Americans were going to win, that the British, by doing better in the war, they might have brought along some of those disaffected back to the empire. So great question.
Yeah, I like that question a lot. So our next question is from Kevin G, who asked, were there any attempts by either side to seek peace and resolve their differences after the proclamation of rebellion, or the Olive Branch Petition?
Yeah, great question. So the the people that come to fight the Americans in the beginning actually have authorization to make peace with them, particularly the Howe brothers, who were the leading, leaders of the Navy and the British Army. They come to America, and they have like dual authority. They're admiral and general, but they're also peace commissioners. And it's so fascinating that they're not able to get very far, and part of it is just for some real basic reasons. They won't talk to George Washington unless he's just George Washington. But by this point, Washington is General Washington, and the Americans insist that he's General Washington, and the British don't want to acknowledge that. If they acknowledge he's General Washington, maybe that's sort of acknowledging that he has a right to be General Washington, and that sort of reflects independence. And so there's little funny things like that trip up any possibility at negotiation. I sometimes wonder that the war was long. It was America's longest war until Vietnam, and both have now been surpassed by our wars of the 21st century in the Middle East. I sometimes wonder that if the war had dragged out even longer, if both sides maybe would reach a point of just resolution, that they would come to some kind of agreement, some kind of negotiated peace. Of course, the Americans did get the big victory at Yorktown in October of 1781, and the British withdraw from the war with the Americans, but they continue to fight the French for a couple more years, and they do quite well. Actually, the British kind of win the end of the war for themselves against the French.
Taylor, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, so our last question is from Andy K, who asks, do you have any idea what percentage of British citizens were opposed to the war with the American colonies?
Yeah, great question. So they don't, they unfortunately don't have Gallup polls exactly from this era. But I did mention that by different measures, this is, Britain's most unpopular war of the 18th century. And the evidentiary basis for that actually goes back to petitions. So maybe this is a good question to end on, to see how petitions worked. There's dozens and dozens of petitions throughout England and really throughout the British Empire that come into Parliament basically opposing the war, opposing fighting the Americans, because the Americans were seen as cousins and brothers, and as fellow countrymen. And so today, the way scholars look at this event is very much as a civil war. And that's really kind of the language that people were speaking at the time, that the word that's used often in these petitions is that it is unnatural. It's unnatural for us to be fighting our, fellow subjects. So on the basis of that, it's a little bit hard to give exact percentages, but there is a very vocal opposition movement. And I'll just mention one other measure of this that's kind of interesting. There's prisons in England that American soldiers and sailors end up in. And the communities that surround some of these prisons are actually quite generous and in providing supplies and in helping the Americans, which I find really, really interesting. And so it would take generations to establish what we call today the special relationship between Britain and the United States, but you can definitely see those bonds from this period.
Thank you, Denver. That was an absolutely amazing program. We have so many primary sources, like for the American Revolution. I know in the Henry Knox collection alone, there's over 11,000 documents, and each one of them to me is unique and special. We have this one in particular, and as you were talking, it just struck me that this would be a fun one for us to do someday. It's a satirical epitaph for King George III, and they talk about him being the button maker in a very derogatory way. But it would be a fantastic piece for history teachers to work with English teachers, because they make so many references to like world history and different characters in Shakespearean literature. They compared him to Caligula, and it was just, it's amusing. And then the other half of it compares Washington to the, ultimate hero in literature. It's pretty interesting. But we'll have to.
That's a great teaser. We have to do that program sometime.
It's a funny document, like 18th century funny, but really a funny document. And if you can't get enough of the American Revolution, we have a number of programs that we've done over the years. We've done several on the Declaration of Independence and different printings that we have. In April, we did one on Lexington and Concord. So we're going to share that out with you tomorrow. And a few years ago, we did one on Washington's crossing the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton. And when you talk about winning the hearts and minds of people, like that was a really important battle for us to win. Crossing the Delaware, Battle of Trenton, second battle.
Critical,
absolutely amazing. Yeah. But thank you very much for joining us today. I know we had a lot of really great questions in the Q&A. So Taylor did not have an easy job selecting some for you.
Sometimes as a professor, I profess too, so I apologize if we didn't get to enough. I get excited about this stuff.
Do you have a final thought to leave us with?
Again, I just thank everyone who's taken time to join us for this live recording, and those who will watch this later. And again, I hope that this just gives some sense of the complexity of this time, and that this was not an easy thing to do. It wasn't easy for the Americans to declare independence. It's not the case that the good guys versus bad guys, that the British hated liberty. They just thought that there was different means to achieve liberty, and people like John Dickinson, of course, didn't hate liberty and not supporting independence. He was worried about what might happen by doing that. And so seeing these people as complicated like they were, again, I think maybe is a better way to kind of inform our own decisions today, and hopefully give all of us a little more humanity.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have some upcoming programs. So next month, we're going to be looking at a document by the Manhattan Project scientists. It was written in 1945, shortly after the bomb was dropped on, the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. They realized almost immediately the dangers of nuclear weapons, and they started writing some documents about it. So we have those. We're happy to share them with you. And something that makes me really happy is we're going to be talking about the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation with Dr. Ed Ayers. The Civil War is like one of my first loves. So I'm very excited to be jumping into that one. And this weekend, Judith Geisberg will be discussing her book, Last Seen, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families, on book breaks. So please join us for these programs and many, many more of our teacher education programs that you can find on our website. We'll be sending an email tomorrow that has all these programs in it for you to investigate over the long weekend. And with that, happy 4th of July, and we will see you next month. Bye.
You.